Well, hello and welcome to episode 130 of Retro Power Uncut. These episode numbers are going to get out of hand. Anyway, we start in the fabrication shop here with Project Kuma, the second Mark 1 Escort. Carrying on with some Escort theme, you're going to have to bear with it for a long time yet because we've got a full build to do on these, but the latter stages of metalwork are continuing with the second Mark 1 Escort. As you can see, it's now on the lift. I think it was on the lift last week. Yes, it was. Sam is working on this. He's pretty much exclusively working on this, and he's been working in this sort of area. I'll move that transmission jack out of the way just for a minute, just so I can point at things a bit more effectively. That's all still to be trimmed, don't worry about that. He's been working in the top of the transmission tunnel, finishing off the handbrake provision. So we've moved the handbrake levers relative to where they would normally be on a Mark 1 Escort. We've moved them rearward a little bit because we've changed the design of the top of the tunnel quite a lot. So Sam has made a new reinforcement and mounting plate for the handbrake lever, made the threaded bosses on that, welded them on, and then mounted that plate into the top of the transmission tunnel in its new location. And in order to do that, by the time you've removed the spot welds and done all that, you pretty much have to drill the whole top off, ruin the top of the transmission tunnel. So he's made a new section, welded that in and repaired all the top of the tunnel to make all that nice. So he's finished off doing that. He started that last week, he's finished off doing that now. He's then moved on to other bits related to that, which chiefly was getting the, it's tacked on, he'll fully weld it when it's the other way up, getting the handbrake cable outer anchorage fitted into the top of the tunnel cover above the diff, so that's now mounted in. Then he's moved on to the front, to the steering column area. You may or may not recall, small detail, so easily skipped over, where we're using the power assisted steering conversion on these cars using a motor from it's actually from a Vauxhall Allegra. It's available as a new part in the aftermarket as a power steering assist motor. Manufactured, I believe it's NSK, but it's not the same one as the Corsa one that everybody uses. It's slightly smaller and it's got a lower torque output. We've always found with the Corsa type motors, they're overkill really for the assist that you need on a fairly lightweight Escort. So to that end, we've downsized a little because they're a bit more compact, and we're using these smaller NSK units, I think they're NSK, which are fitted to the Vauxhall Allegra and the what's the blooming Suzuki? Anyway, Wagon-R, Suzuki Wagon-R, sporty vehicle that it is. Yeah, the Suzuki Wagon-R and the Vauxhall Allegra use this little motor unit, so it's basically as per the fitment to those vehicles. We're using that motor, and we then putting instead of having a single piece non-collapsible column like the Escort originally had, or more or less non-collapsible, we're using a two-section column with a downlink with a pair of UJs and a link kicking it across, so that instead of having the angled column like you have in an Escort, you have the column straight facing straight to the driver, and then kick the column across further down. To that end, we need to have a rotating section of steering shaft going through the bulkhead, and to accommodate that, we fit a rotating seal in the bulkhead. We use a 3/4 inch shaft for the steering column, 3/4 inch piece of EN16T with flats milled on each end. We use 3/4 inch DD shaft for the steering column at the top, going onto the normal, I think it's 9/16 spline, I believe, onto the UJ, onto the steering rack. And where it goes through the bulkhead, we machine up a little piece and fabricate it, weld it into the bulkhead with a hole in to clear the column, and then a register and 3 tapped holes that we then machine an aluminium little carrier from a piece of aluminium that screws onto that, seals onto it, and that carries a rotary shaft seal. And so the rotary shaft seal, put a little bit of silicone grease on that, the column goes through it, and it acts as a really good water seal, keeps that completely impervious to road dirt and whatever. It's just a nice way of doing it, but it still allows the column to have a tiny bit of flex and movement without rubbing on anything other than a rotary shaft seal that's designed to take that. So it's just a neat way of doing it. So he's been working on that, a lot of elaboration there, but Sam's been working on that area, and he's also just popped the diff back in while he's working on the handbrake provision and that side of things. And I think that's pretty much, there's been some other detail work going on, but pretty much, without boring everybody to death, that's pretty much where we're at on Project Kuma in terms of the work on the shell. We'll pick up another little job for that in a minute, but prior to that, we're going to swing by here, Project Churchill, where Stu's beavering away on cooler pack again at the moment. Oil cooler's down there. He'd already done the mountings for the oil cooler. There's been a bit of toing and froing, as we mentioned last week, in terms of the air conditioning condenser, in that the one we had, which we thought would fit, after a bit of toing and froing and going around in circles, we realised didn't fit. So we got I think it's a 37 Ford market hot rod type aircon condenser designed for sort of Ford coupes, and that does fit really well. So Stu's now sorting out the mountings for that. I think we touched on that he was going to be doing that last week, but he's now sorting out the mountings for that, mountings for the dryer for the air conditioning, and just getting everything to fit in the front end. We've covered that before. It's a bit of a crack record, I know, but there is a lot of work in getting all of the parts to fit in the space, with nothing rubbing on anything else, all the plumbing provisions neat and tidy, hose routing so that the hoses can't rub on anything, so that you can actually assemble it and disassemble it without damaging any paintwork, yada yada yada. A lot of stages to that job, and Stu's working on all that now. In tandem with that, there's been some knock-on effects in terms of the bonnet catch, in that with a clean sheet of paper, we wouldn't necessarily want to use the Mark II Jag one. There were some issues with interference underneath here. Stu has Range Rover Classic quite well etched into his head, because both Stu and I, in our spare time, are building Range Rover Classics with Chevy V8s in. And so to that end, Stu had a pretty good image of a Range Rover bonnet catch in his head, and a quick check revealed that you can buy all the parts brand new for them inexpensively, and they work, and they're a pretty decent sort of catch arrangement. So he's actually done a bit of re-engineering under the bonnet and in the slam panel to accommodate Range Rover Classic, but new Range Rover Classic catch mechanism, which then solves our clearance issues and gives us a nice catch that's all available with all new parts, that isn't worn out, yada yada yada. It's a neat way of doing it. So he's done some modification under the bonnet to the little reinforcer panel at the front to mount that. There was a problem there anyway, and the threads were damaged in that, so we kind of needed to resolve that anyway. So that's killed two birds with one stone there, and meant that we've resolved the bonnet catch and the damage to the bonnet. And he's then been doing some work on getting the bonnet to fit properly onto the wings. Generally, the Mark II Jag bonnet does need a little bit of titivating and adjustment, shall we say, to get it to follow the line of the wing nicely. He's been doing that as well, just to make sure that everything lines up and the shut lines are all good. That's all looking good now. So yeah, that's basically where Stu's at on the front of Project Churchill Jag. Swinging this way, as you can see, lots has been going on. There's muck on the floor and things for reasons that will be revealed, in that we've been busy working on the new project that we mentioned last week. But I'm going to pause by here again. Tom's actually been put, everybody, there seems to be a recirculating illness going on here. We don't generally have people off ill very much, but there's been a bug that's been doing the rounds repeatedly, and Tom was actually off yesterday and Tuesday, and not looking well on Tuesday afternoon, and he came in Tuesday morning looking pretty green, and ended up having to go home in the afternoon. But he's back again today. He's not working on it right this second, because typically I was kind of hoping we'd be able to video with Tom working away, because he might have a reclamp to do, which is the non-noisy part of doing this job. Unfortunately, he hasn't got a reclamp to do, because he's currently chasing out that tuck there. So he can't be chasing that tuck out while we're doing the video, because you won't be able to hear a thing. All you'll be able to hear is hammering, and everybody will be walking around with ear defenders on. So at the moment, all clamped up, front half of front wheel arch being worked on. I think it was a rear that we saw last week, rear half of a front wheel arch last week. He's working on a front half of front wheel arch, which is the trickiest section to do, as you can see by the sheer number of blocks. These are all grippers which are bolted on, which grip this inside face and stop that bulging out and stop it swelling on the corners. So they're really good for that. We've got some old hardwood blocks that are, I've forgotten the blooming Kerowing. They're old truck body floor material, which are really hard wearing, really tough stuff. We use some lumps of that, plus some bits of pallet wood and whatever else comes to hand, and then lots of old pieces of conveyor belting. This rubber is old quarry conveyor belt, which is an ideal rubber, just got the right give to it to grip under these MDF blocks, so that it clamps the steel down, stops it moving excessively, but allows it to form a tuck, which is what's going on here, because you want to focus the tucks into areas where you can then chase them out and shrink the material. We mentioned it last week. I'm not going to go on forever about it. The clamping is necessary to prevent the material actually physically moving all over the place, because if you didn't clamp it, it would be impossible. It would just grow. Each time you hit the material, it would just spread and lift. So it's necessary to clamp it down to control the material, but at the same time you want it to be able to form these tucks so that you can control where they form, i.e. they're in between the peak pressure of these clamps, and then flatten them out, causing the material to shrink and thicken where the tucks are. That conveyor belt material is brilliant for doing that. So anyway, yeah, that's where we're at with that. Tom's hitting that a lot, hitting his hand a fair bit. He's got a, probably mentioned it last week, he's made a stronger hand protector now to avoid beating his hand quite so much, but he's still hit it a few times. The problem is, as I said last week, he's working around the clamps. Your eye's always drawn to making sure you don't hit the clamp with your hammer hand, and that's when you miss and hit your hand. So there we go. Yeah, that's progressing well. Moving on from that, we'll touch on Project 1 Escort, which is in here. We'll walk by Redux M3, which is now in Raptor, awaiting engine bay paint prep and various other surfaces paint prep. That's pretty much at a point now where we're waiting for parts at that point, and various other things going on in the background. So that's probably not going to change a lot in the next sort of short term anyway. So that's waiting there. Moving on to Project 1 Escort. We are doing the primary stages of filler work on this. I think had we started that last week? I lose track now. I can't remember whether we quite started it or not last week, but we were in primary stages of filler work on it, checking fit on the front wings. I'm halfway through reaming out or boring out the hinges to take the new wrapped steel back bronze bushes that we put in. We're using stainless steel shoulder bolts and wrapped bushes in the hinges just to make them a bit nicer. I've done one side, I've got to do the other side, then we'll do the very fine. I didn't want to do them before blasting because that'll destroy the bushes, but we do want to do it before we get very far into body prep so that we know that the door alignment's not going to change. So that's pretty much where we're on that. It's all zinc sprayed. Guys are working on doing the upside down stuff first, all the surfaces that are easier to prep, i.e. the bottom of the quarters, the bottom of the sills, the bottom of the wings, bottom of the front balance, all the areas that are easier to do with the car the wrong way up. They're going to do those, then spin it the right way up, put it either on a trolley or on its wheels or a bit of both, and do all the top side prep. And at that point we'll finalise the door fits to wing, double check clearances and everything, and then the wings will get welded on. Because they're all now, the wings have got to be Raptored on the inside yet, and we're going to Raptor the inner wing area as well. Then we'll clean the Raptor off along the weld lines and weld the wings on, again after doing all the alignment. So yeah, basically we're almost into full-on sanding time. So yeah, we're progressing there. Steve's beavering away, Gaz has been working on this as well. The booth's running. There's a job in there that I think Cal's going to talk about in a bit, so I won't elaborate on that, but the booth's running because there's a little bit of paintwork being done in there as well. So I think that wraps up where we are in here, and we'll move on to the new project. I'm going to call it, we might change it later on, but I think for the moment we're calling it Project Allegra. Shall I call it the Allegra, or has it actually got a proper project name now? I'm trying to remember now.
Lucky Strike.
Ah yes, Lucky Strike. I'm not going to confirm the name yet because I don't actually know the confirmed name for the project, but I'm going to call it the Allegra for the minute. We'll go to the blast room. We'll have a quick look in there. It's a bit carnage around here because we've got the compressor in. This old girl, by the way, we always walk past it. People will be seeing what it was. It's older than me. It's our blasting compressor. It's a 1976 Hydrovane, 150 CFM-ish, diesel powered. It's got an old Ford Dorset diesel engine in it, 4-cylinder Dorset diesel engine. Say very old, but we keep thinking about getting a more modern one, and actually the more modern ones are less reliable. I did a oil air separator rebuild on it a few years back, and since then it just keeps on going, keeps on blowing lots of air and does a good job of our blasting. So the poor old girl keeps getting dragged in and out of the workshop every time we're doing some blasting. We haven't got the electricity supply on site isn't big enough to run a compressor of the size we would need to run the blast unit. So, you know, 150 CFM compressors plus the workshop air, you'd really be needing over 200 CFM compressor, and that's a pretty substantial electricity pull. So we use a diesel, 50 horsepower diesel compressor for doing the work in here. So that's what this whole thing is. That's a unit for, as we're walking past, that's the unit I built for, that screens our blasting grit. Again, walking past, so you're not wondering what these things are. That's a little thing I built for screening our blasting grit. It screens out the coarse pieces, which are usually bits of car, and it screens out the fine stuff, which is the talced down blasting glass, and gives us a middle fraction that we can reuse. And it just minimises the grit use, but more to the point, it minimises the waste stream coming out from the blasting, in that the coarse stuff is pretty minimal and the fine stuff's pretty minimal, and then we remix in new, fresh, coarse, or it's not classed as coarse, but much more coarse glass into that, and that gives us the spectrum of cut that we need, because to blast at a reasonable rate you need a mixture of coarser elements and finer elements in the media, and that recycling gives us that mixture of the finer and coarser grit. So going off on tangents, but that's what that is. That's our screening, the screen deck that I built. Anyway, more to the point, here we are, Austin Allegro. The shell is stripped. That was finished, more or less finished yesterday. There's one or two last little bits to take off. A couple of bits like the door hinges and a couple of things still to come off, hence the tool trolley in here. A couple of little bits to unbolt. And then the next stage is going to be cutting out the obviously extraneous bits, which is principally the centre part of the floor pan. So we're going to be removing the central part of the floor pan. So that just eases, we know we're not going to be using that area, and it eases the blasting process, in that when you're blasting the inside of the car, the grit tends to roll round and all comes back at you, and the visors in the blasting helmet really don't last very long when you're doing that blasting. It etches the visor up really quickly, and you're changing the visors in really quick succession. So we're going to remove that section of the floor just to make the blasting a bit easier, and to help with a bit of rigidity, Mark's just made up some box section sticks in here just to tie the shell together, keep the rigidity a little bit while it's on the spit, because these were not a very strong shell. Once we've got that done and got it blasted, it's going to go back out into the workshop, it's going to get scanned, we'll remove the wings, do a bit of clean up around inside the wing area where we probably won't have been able to blast too well, because as soon as you start blasting up inside, we've got to remove these splashes as well. As soon as we start blasting up inside here, you start to actually stretch the wing out. As you're trying to focus on cleaning up the inner wing, you end up stretching the outer wing out, and we don't want to do that. So we'll blast inside there, but it'll have to be fairly careful. And what we can do then, once we've done all that, we're going to scan it, then we're going to remove the outer wings, drill the spot welds out, remove the outer wings, then we can finish cleaning up the inner wing. As it is, a lot of the inner wing won't be being used anyway, but we want to get the area clean so that we can get all the data in a scan before we commit to doing anything too much, because we know that that area of the body shell is going to be quite critical in terms of metalwork. The A-pillar into scuttle area is going to be quite a key area in terms of the metalwork. So that's pretty much where we're at with the Allegro. It's all stripped, all the parts we're not using have been removed, and it's now at a stage where it's pretty much just cleaning up, blasting and scanning on that one. Moving on from there, I'm going to skip past the camera and we'll wander over to the Integra, which is also stripped and has been blasted. It's been a busy week. This has been stripped down, media blasted. There's a bit of rust to contend with, nothing too traumatic, fortunately. There's a little structural part on the, I'd kind of call it the rear beam, where ahead of the fuel tank, the suspension mounting's out board of that, where the structure goes onto the end of the sill. There's a bit of rot there, but it doesn't actually interfere with the suspension mounting, and it's actually in an area we're going to be modifying anyway, so that's quite fortuitous. The floor pan is quite rusty on the driver's side, it's a right-hand drive car, the driver's side. That's quite well perforated. That had quite a lot of surface rust in it from some water that had been leaking into the car. So we've got some repair work to do there, but that's going to be done later. We're going to leave that until we've done the structural work. There'll be some repair work to do there though, so you'll be able to see that. Other than that, it's all pretty good. The other area that's got a bit of corrosion, convenient, is another area we've got to modify, which is the very back edge of the floor, where it's welded along here. But you can actually see it down in that corner just down there. There's actually there's actually, I'm making Jamie's life really hard because it's going to be really difficult to get a camera down to it. But there's some rot down in that corner down there, so that's going to need attending to in the rear edge of the floor. However, we've got to shorten the wheelbase on this car by 131 millimeters. And I'm going to be shortening the rear of the floor, the main floor pan where it joins at that point where that corrosion is. So that's quite convenient. We're going to shorten the floor pan there, and then we're going to alter the tunnel slightly ahead of that and take 130 mil out slightly further forward on the underside reinforcer for the tunnel, where the two little chassis rails that run down the centre tunnel, they run parallel for a section in this sort of region underneath. I'm going to shorten that, the understructure, the reinforcing structure will be shortened there, and then the floor pan is going to be shortened at the back, so I can keep the handbrake cable pass-throughs, keep that function but move it forward basically. It'll all become clear when we do it. The floor pan's going to be shortened there, and then that's the thin end of the metalwork. There's a lot of other work to be done. The sill structures have got to be completely refabricated, and obviously there's quite a lot of work to do around the bulkhead area. The bulk, if you'll pardon me, of the bulkhead will actually be remaining as is basically, as far as we can determine. Obviously, stepping back from that sort of detail, you'll see the car is now sat on a select jig, on our bank of select jigs. It's on 4 fixtures at the minute because I've only just put it on just before doing this video. We've got the box of fixtures, they're on hire from Body Shop Solutions at the moment. We will get these, get it all fixtured, check that it's dimensionally correct, and then I'll be building some other fixtures to pick up from some slightly different places, so we've got a bit of versatility in what we're doing in terms of putting suspension in and out. The select fixtures allow the fitment of suspension, but in some areas they're only really suited to checking, not to actually holding the car in alignment while the suspension parts are fitted. So I'm going to do some fabrication. Once we've checked that the shell is straight, which I'm 99.9% certain it is, then I will reduce the number of the select fixtures down to 4 at each end, and then I'm going to fabricate some further fixtures so I can remove the select ones entirely, and it will enable us to have the rear half of the floor pan on a skid on the jig, so that when we do the floor pan shorten, I can actually keep all the points jigged and literally just slide the back half of the car forward on the jig using some alignment blocks and stop blocks, so I can pull that forward, stop it. I know I've moved it to 131 mil. At that point we can then join everything back up. So that's what's going on there. As I say, that'll be unpicked. Effectively the car will be altered at pre-existing seams in the body. So to the uninitiated, no one would ever actually know there's anything being changed under there. That's the plan with that. So yeah, car's beginning to be fixtured onto the jig. Hopefully later on I'll be able to get back onto that and get some more fixtures on it and carry on checking all the alignment, but we're pretty confident it's good, and it's just dropped onto the fixtures now. They're all dead in line. There's literally the bolt holes are all back on so far, and I've no reason to think there'll be anything other than that. The car has certainly never been crashed. It's certainly never had any damage at all, apart from corrosion to the quarter panels. That's the only problem with it is the corrosion. So that pretty much wraps up. Obviously, I've kind of skipped over the strip down. There's obviously quite a lot of work. Mark and Scott have been busy, and Rich have all been busy getting both of the cars stripped down, and that's been a marathon effort over the last, what would it be? I guess 7 days. 6 days even. They've been a pretty marathon effort in getting both cars stripped, one blasted on the jig and the other one ready to be blasted. So yeah, all going really well. Been a busy part of the workshop for the last week. I think at that point, another good point. Sorry, while this was in the blast room, I forget plenty of things. Just as well, I've got a Jamie to remind me as well as the camera here. Yeah, the other point, while this was in the blast room, while we were actually waiting for the edge primer, while we were waiting for the edge primer to dry, because we actually put the edge primer on in the blast room. It's not worth putting the car into the booth to do it. While we were waiting for the etch primer on one half of the car to dry, what we tend to do is do the etch underneath, then turn the car over and do the etch on top. While we were waiting for that to dry, George actually went in there and scanned the underside of the car, and then when we'd done the top half of the car, he then went in and scanned the top half of the car. It's a very good point to do the scanning work because the car's clean, and the matte effect left by the blaster with the very thin coating of etch primer on it is a perfect surface to scan. You don't need any scanning spray. The matte surface is just brilliant for scanning. You get a really nice resolution on the scan. So George has got a full underside and inside and engine bay and full structure scan of the Integra. And the same will be done for the Allegro once that's blasted. So we've got the 2 scans, and we can then actually do the meshing of the floor pan and body shell in CAD just to resolve a few areas. There's a lot of areas where, to be honest, the tape measure will tell you enough. But certainly in the A-pillar bulkhead area, the scan data will be quite invaluable, because there's quite a technical bit of work going to be required around the A-pillars in terms of door hinges, bulkhead ends, reinforcement into the inner wing, and that side of things. There's quite a lot of work needed there. So that's where the CAD data, the scan data and CAD will be really, really useful and really beneficial to the project. I think that pretty much wraps up where we're at with the Allegro and Integra project. So I think that's about it from this side, and at that point I will hand over to Cal.
Hello and welcome to the assembly shop. This feels weird not introducing the video, but definitely the popular opinion was starting with the metalwork and then coming through here makes a lot more sense, which it does. It's strange the way you kind of just get into a routine without thinking about the reason behind it. Anyway, Morris, so earlier today I drove this for the first time, so driven probably 2 miles in it now, down to our local MOT centre and back, and it's always really nerve-wracking driving a car, a build like this, when there's so much custom stuff on it. There's so many things that could not be right, you know, just from suspension noise, overall noise, vibration, harshness issues, leaks, wiring. There's so many things, potential pitfalls, and there's always some where they could be extremely difficult to solve. So it's very nerve-wracking doing the first drive, but I have to happily report it was probably one of the best first drives I've done. So suspension feels absolutely spot on. I probably just need to soften the rear dampers slightly, but the precision feel of it, the steering feel, it's like an MX-5, only even more so, which is fantastic. The engine felt great, gearbox felt great, clutch feels great, brakes are good. Temperatures and pressures were all good. So far leak free. Yeah, couldn't really ask for a lot better, to be honest. There's always some little tiny bits and bobs, but I'm trying to think what they even were. I mean, so far I noticed we'd lost a bit of fluid out of the power steering cap, but we then realised we'd forgotten to fit the little filters. We designed these caps with like a pinhole, and then they've got like a sintered filter inside, and we actually forgot to fit the filters. So I suspect that might well solve the problem there. What else was there? Really not a lot, actually. I'm struggling to even think of anything that I've noticed. So really it's just, I've got various little detail jobs left to do on it. Things like handbrake gaiter, gear stick gaiter, general tweaking and tidying jobs, and then it's just getting more miles on it really now, and just going through that process of going from the initial nerve-wracking, oh God, is it going to fundamentally feel okay, to getting more comfortable in the car and gradually being able to focus more on the details. But certainly, even from a sort of knocks and rattles point of view, there was nothing, you know, no squeaks, knocks and rattles. The refinement felt great. So it's a very good starting point, and hopefully we'll, as we test this over the coming weeks, we'll get some in-car footage. James has now finished his boot panelling work, so that will be going off to Dean to be upholstered. He did one other job this week, was these wheels, I don't think they've ever been shown fitted yet, but they've got a centre cap with basically a sort of mock-up centre lock nut on them. And I fitted those caps for the first time the other day, and I wasn't entirely happy with the look of them. I thought the nut looked too chunky, so James has turned down those nuts and the spigot that they thread onto. And it's totally transformed the look of them, so I'm really happy with those. But we're just going to make up some little machine centre caps to go in and now that we'll laser a logo into. So that'll be the finishing touch on the wheels. And then, as you can see, the masking tape's there to stone chip protect, but one of the things that will be on the cards is doing PPF protection over the rear arches so we don't get stone chips on the rear. Yeah, so it's basically details, getting some more miles on it. Watch this space. Camaro. So John last week was getting all the dash built up so we could get all of the vent ductwork in there, and we could see what remaining space we had for electronics mounting. Because one of the things, I mean, this car dates back metalwork-wise a good few years now, and we probably weren't doing our dry build processes as thoroughly as we do now, so we hadn't planned a position for the ECU or PDMs in there. So we were just seeing where we could do that, and we've got a really good plan with that. The glove box, we're going to have the two ECU master PDMs in there, so you can open the glove box, see those. The plugs will be on the top with the wires disappearing over the top, so that'll be on a sort of probably a flocked or upholstered aluminium panel. And then the engine ECU we've done right at the front of the transmission tunnel, so that will be a cover for that will be incorporated into the front of the centre console, which was being designed at the moment. I think I showed some of that last week. So plans in place for that. Centre console design's pretty much there. We're going to do some mock-ups of the whole console. So we've done a 3D print of what will be a machined part at the top that holds the instruments and the cordless phone charger. The rest of it, our plan is to machine from high density foams, but we're going to do a sort of skeletal representation of that just to make sure we're happy with the shape of that. So that's on the cards next. And then Scott has been working on the inlet. So this is something that we had made provision for in terms of mounting, but we needed to actually make this. And that is the intake tract and cold air feed and air filter arrangement. Now on these LSs that are running the original management, they use an airflow meter, and that has to be in a fairly stable straight section of intake tube. So it's 4-inch diameter tube. It needs to be in at least a 6-inch straight section, ideally with no bend into it, because we've had problems before where if there's a sweep into it, the air's biased to one side slightly and can skew off the airflow meter reading slightly. And the other challenge is we've got to come between this panel work here and this tube on the top here, which is above the radiator, and the radiator comes up pretty much flush with that. And all of that was intended to be hidden under this central sort of cosmetic panel we have running over the middle of the engine. So yeah, Scott's in the process of fabricating that. So we've basically got this 45, which will be black eventually. He's then done a piece that brings this round piece to straight. It then tapers down to an oval shape, and we did the maths on the surface area of that, so that it's the same area as the 4-inch round. Section comes over here, round and down, then tapers back to around here. Then we're going to have a 90 silicon at the front there. That's then where we've got the straight section with the airflow meter in it, and then a cone filter that will sit just behind this intake, sort of in the front balance here. So the plan is all there. It's looking good. Scott's just going through the motions of fabricating everything. We'll be able to get that in. We'll also be able to do the breather plumbing then, because the breathers plumb in to that intake. This is probably a interesting point if anybody's working on LSs to note that there's an integral breather on the crate engine. It's a little flexible pipe down here which goes from the throttle body to the valley of the engine block, and that's actually where the breather fume from the block is drawn in via the intake through that pipe. And the pipes that are on the cam covers are actually incoming air. They're not breathing out, they're breathing in, because there's a vacuum in the inlet manifold that's sucking out of that block breather. So they need to be connected to filtered air, but because the engine's burning that air, it needs to be taken into account by the airflow meter. So the way you plumb those is to have them in the intake tract after the airflow meter, plumbed up to those two spigots. So basically the engine is actually breathing some of its air that it burns through those intakes, through the block, and then back out of the valley of the block and through the little flexible pipe there. So a tip there, which in the manuals that come with these engines, it does explain that, but it doesn't word it very well. And I remember the first LS we did a good few years ago now. It took me a while to try to sort of get my head around what they were getting at. And on the subject of LSs, the Jensen, which we're now on sort of the phase 2 of the intake tract, and pretty much what we're doing on the Camaro there. So Bobby had done a sort of prototype last week, went back to it to try and get a bit more space. We were struggling to get a decent sized filter in, still have room for an elbow that end and for the throttle body elbow to come out this side and clear it. And the problem was he was trying to get this box big enough that the filter could come out of it, and obviously he needed to pull the filter off its spigot and out. And then he came up with the idea of actually if he makes this end of the housing bolt on with the filter attached to the spigot in there, you can take the whole assembly off and unbolt that and actually pull that off, so you don't need room to get the filter out through the housing. And that enabled it to be much more compact. So this is looking really good actually. Obviously this is going to need all its final welding and making look pretty, and then he's started on the final. This was kind of a temporary structure before. He's doing this tube structure here. I think this was intended as a prototype, but actually it's come out that well, and I think we're going to leave that as the final structure. He's made up the intake pipe that goes under there, similar situation to that one. It's got the airflow meter in it in a straight section, and that's one of the reasons we needed this to be a bit of a bizarre shape, because we can't just come out of here and have a filter here, because we need a decent straight section to get a stable airflow meter reading. So that's why we've gone down straight along with the airflow down there. We'll have the breathers plumbed in under there as well, and that should work really nicely. So now he's kind of got this decent structure in here. He's working on making structure around here a bit tidier. Then he'll do the mountings for the bonnet catches, which have been mocked up again but not done in their final guise. And yeah, just start progressing forward. And as I said last week, this will all be panelled in with a carbon fibre shroud that makes this look pretty and flows into an engine cover as well. So it's all going in the right direction. If we plod over here, so another exciting moment of the week, E-type engine going in, although not without its calamity. So we'll come to that in a sec. Before we put the engine in, we finished the alternator mount. So I think last week we showed we did a scan of the engine and we were just designing an alternator mount. It's quite difficult to get in the space we want, because it's got to go above the, we want it on the off side of the car to keep the aircon compressor, the near side to keep the aircon plumbing neater. And on the off side there's not much space. You can't go under the upper front chassis tube because the steering column's there, so it's got to be quite high up, and there aren't any mounting points in the block high up. There are on the near side for the standard alternator mount, so we've had to do a mounting that bolts lower down but is sturdy enough that we don't get any fatigue from the alternator. And we came up with, George came up with a really nice design. Bolts on, it's an extension of the engine mount, but then it has a forward-facing piece that bolts onto some of the sort of longitudinal bolts at the front engine cover that originally held a tensioner. So it's a really sturdy bracket. The alternator is going to be fixed. We're going to have a belt run that runs around the alternator and the other two pulleys, the water pump and the crank pulley, which solves the problem of the belt run going through the water pump outlet. And then we're going to tension it by having a tensioner in the middle of the run on the near side of the engine, between the water pump and the crank pulley. So it should be good. That's a good solution. And then that was the last thing we wanted to do before we got the engine in. So we got all the gearbox on. That turned up, I think, possibly after last week's video actually, from Elite Racing Transmissions, and got it all in. However, that was when the disappointment started. So the prop shaft, I don't know if it was miscommunication or what, but the prop shaft and the gearbox mount are for a shorter wheelbase version, presumably a Series 1. So they're not right, so we've got to get them off. But perhaps more frustratingly, the gearbox is actually too tight on the tunnel, so we're going to have to do some tunnel easing. Wouldn't be the first time we've bought a sort of supposed off-the-shelf conversion and it not be that good, I'll be honest. In fact, there's almost a track record of every conversion we've bought off the shelf not being really up to scratch. But so we're going to have to do a little bit of probably some easing of the transmission casing, shall we say, and possibly a little bit of the tunnel. We might get away with just basically stripping this piece out of the transmission casing. But yes, consequently, this has got to come back out again. But we'll get the engine and transmission out, get the new prop shaft in, do the modifications on the transmission housing, and in every other way it looks great. The shifter position's in the good place. The top of the gearbox casing looks good space-wise. It fits under the original tunnel top. It's just very tight in the front corners of where the tunnel meets the bulkhead. But we'll get there with that, get all that back in, and then we can start doing the final build-up of ancillaries on it. So that's where we're at with that. Land Cruiser, not a huge amount. The inlet manifold arrived, I think I showed that last week. James has just been working on the fuel rails because we've got to get that anodised, and there's some other parts to anodise as well. We wanted to get the fuel rails machined, which we couldn't do until we had the manifold in front of us. So James is in the process of drilling and machining the fuel rails, so we can then send off everything together for anodising. So that's going to be the manifold itself, the fuel rails, the brackets for the fuel rails, and there was something else which I forget off the top of my head. Oh, actually the nuts that he machined for the wheel centre caps on the Morris. So we're trying to get a batch of anodising away. But yeah, that's about where we're at in here. What I am going to do is go through some questions. I said last week that we would answer some questions if you put your questions in the comments. So again, this week, if you've got any questions, put them in. So, question, really popular one from Alan Ward is, how many projects are waiting in the pipeline? I.e., how long from when a project is okayed to when it actually starts? So our earliest available project start date is the very end of 2027 at the minute. So we're talking 4.5-ish years from now until the first available date. And then typically a project is, I don't know, we like to say 18 months to 2 years. Obviously some of the more complicated ones lately have taken longer. So yeah, the wait from now, booking in point now to completion of project consequently is fairly large. So that's that one. What else? Andy Fairchild, have you ever had a really expensive design fail? One of those where you've gone so far in time and materials, but just run into the wall of nope, can't make it work. Now, yeah, I totally get what you mean with that. Now, I was racking my brains and thinking we must have had something like that, but I don't think we've ever had a massive major one. I mean, I don't want to tempt fate with the project like the Allegro at the minute, but in terms of the overall concept of the projects, we've always been able to take them to completion. We definitely continuously run into small incidents like that. I mean, things that are popping into my head, just small things like the charger, you know, that we painted a few months back. There was the boot lid. We were kind of assessing the condition of it, and we decided in favour of repairing it rather than replacing it. And then when we got stuck into repairing it, we kind of got so many hours into it and thought, you know what, this is just not going to work. And it's the key really is having the vision to call the judgments at the right point, basically, rather than constantly going and with determination that you will be able to solve the problem. It's looking ahead and thinking, look, I can see this is going to happen. I think we've had something similar on the Escorts where we bought some carbon fibre panels for them, bonnets and boot lids, and we were looking at them the other day and thinking, you know what, I just don't think these are good enough to use. So I think we're going to have to make the call to actually make our own carbon bonnets, having already bought the off-the-shelf ones. So there are constantly little things like that where we kind of think, you know what, we're going to have to just call this one at this point, suffer the losses at this point, which aren't too bad, rather than continuing to plough on more time and money into something which we can see is not going to go right. So yeah, it's a complicated answer to that one. We've never had a total disaster, but we constantly have little incidents where we think, you know what, we've put time into that, but we just need to call it now and just go down a different route. I might go for one more, which was John or John T. What's the plan for the wheels on the Jensen? I find that the most intriguing build you've ever done and can't quite imagine the end result. Well, we'll put an image of the rendering up now so you can see what our vision of the end result is. But in particular, I think the wheels will be the vital part. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and actually that's the case with a lot of projects. The wheels are definitely the key to the overall cosmetic look. So the plan on the Jensen is wire wheels made by Torino, which is the company that made the ones on the E-Type, except they will be bigger diameter. They're likely to be 16s. They'll be wider. We're going to do some pretty wide wheels on it, so it'll be, I would say, 9s on the rear, 8s on the front width-wise. They are likely to be black, and we're going to try and get a sort of chunky-ish profile. They're not going to be like the E-Type ones, but I don't want the tyres to be too skinny. So yeah, we'll see when we get to that point. We're a little way off wheels on that one at the minute, but that's the plan in terms of wheels. And that's what we've got time for this week. So yeah, get your questions in the comments, and again, the top questions I will answer next week, and we'll see you then.